Hello everyone and welcome to Sherlock Tales. I'm thrilled to have you here for another long-form mystery. Before we dive in, let me know in the comments, where are you watching from and what time is it there? Get comfortable, relax, and prepare for a classic Holmesian mystery unlike any other. It was in the waning days of October, as the last golden leaves were swept along Baker Street by the moaning wind, that Sherlock Holmes received a letter both intriguing and uncharacteristically delicate in its phrasing. I'd just returned from a morning walk and found Holmes at his violin, coaxing from it a melancholic melody that seemed to mirror the chill outside. "Ah, Watson," he said, setting the instrument aside, "how pleasant it is to observe a man who walks for the sake of walking, a man of habit, yet without compulsion. Did you pass the tobacconist on your way back?" I handed him the pouch of Turkish tobacco he had requested earlier, and took my seat by the fire. "Nothing out of the ordinary today?" Holmes held up an envelope. "On the contrary, we may have before us a matter of no ordinary interest. Read." I took the letter, unfolded the parchment, and read aloud. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes, my name is Cecily Harrogate. I implore you to come to our estate in Devonshire at once. A most peculiar and frightening sequence of events has transpired. There is reason to believe that my brother's death, recorded officially as an unfortunate accident, was in fact a murder. I am fearful for my own life and that of my nephew, the last heir to the Harrogate legacy. I can say no more in writing. Your discretion and urgency are paramount. A carriage will be sent to meet you at the Paddington station this Friday morning. Please, Mr. Holmes, I beg of you. Yours most faithfully, Cecily Harrogate." I looked up. "Harrogate? That name rings a bell. Isn't the family connected to the old glass works and salt mines in Devon?" "Precisely," Holmes replied, already packing his satchel. "Their estate straddles the salt cliffs of Clennon Bay. Curious that such an old and insulated family would call upon me." "And what do you make of her brother's death?" He paused. "Only this, that for a woman of her standing to imply murder is either the product of desperation or certainty. Either condition demands our attention. You'll accompany me, of course." "Of course," I said, with that familiar thrill of anticipation stirring inside me. The train to Devon was uneventful, and we found ourselves in the back of a closed carriage by mid-afternoon, winding through a countryside cloaked in fog. The coachman said little, but when asked about the Harrogate estate, he crossed himself subtly and murmured, "Strange goings-on, sir. They say the cliffs whisper at night." Holmes quirked an eyebrow but said nothing. We arrived at dusk. Harrogate Manor loomed above the cliffs like a fortress, built of ancient stone blackened by sea spray and centuries. Its windows were dark save for a single flickering light in the west wing. Miss Cecily Harrogate awaited us in the great hall. She was a woman of perhaps 40 years, tall and pale, with an expression caught somewhere between grief and resolve. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, I am deeply grateful you came," she said, voice quiet but urgent. "I fear there isn't much time." She led us into the library, where a fire crackled weakly and the walls were lined with tomes too ancient to read without gloves. A large oil portrait hung over the mantel, depicting a stern man with piercing eyes. Cecily followed our gaze. "That was my brother, Alaric. He died 3 weeks ago. They say he fell from the cliffs during a storm, but I found this in his study the next day." She handed Holmes a scrap of torn parchment, on which was scrawled in a trembling hand, "He waits beneath, where no man treads. If I vanish, seek the amber eye." Holmes turned it over. curious phrasing. Who waits beneath, and what is this amber eye? I don't know, Cecily said, but I fear the message is connected to the Harrogate heirloom. An heirloom? Yes. A jewel, an amber pendant, centuries old, said to be cursed. It was passed from generation to generation. My brother wore it the night he died. It has not been seen since. Holmes's gaze sharpened. And you believe someone wanted that jewel badly enough to kill for it? Cecily's voice dropped to a whisper. I know someone did. I saw a figure near the cliffs that night. It wasn't Alaric. And now I hear noises at night, scraping from inside the walls, whispering near my nephew's chamber. We were interrupted by a loud bang from upstairs. Cecily turned white. That came from Edward's room. Holmes was up the stairs in a flash with me close behind. At the end of a long corridor, a heavy door stood ajar. Inside was a boy of perhaps 12, sitting upright in bed, pale and shaking. There was a man, he whispered, in the wall. Holmes examined the panelling and tapped gently along the far corner. A dull thud responded on one plank, different from the hollow knocks of the others. Holmes produced a penknife and pried it open. Behind it was a narrow crawl space, and the unmistakable glint of something metallic. Holmes reached in and pulled out, not the pendant, but a dagger. Its edge was stained with something brown and dry. The handle was carved with a sigil I didn't recognize, an eye surrounded by flames. Holmes handed it to me. Watson, note the weight. This was no ordinary weapon. Look at the balance, meant for swift, close work. No doubt about it, this was used to kill someone. But who would hide it here? I asked. Cecily entered the room, face pale. That dagger belonged to our groundskeeper. He vanished the day after Alaric's death. They said he fled to London. Holmes' eyes gleamed. And perhaps he did, or perhaps he never left the estate at all. He turned to the boy. Edward, my lad, did you see the man's face? The boy nodded. He had only one eye, and it glowed like gold. Holmes exchanged a look with me. The amber eye, he whispered. We have our first piece of the puzzle, Watson, and I fear it's only the beginning. The air in young Edward's room had grown noticeably colder. Holmes lingered near the open wall panel, his long fingers tracing the grain of the hidden plankwork, while I consoled the frightened child. Miss Harrogate stood beside us with a hand to her chest, her breathing shallow. There is a network of narrow passages behind the walls, she said quietly, built during the reign of Charles I. The house was once used to shelter fleeing royalists during the Civil War. We seldom mention them. Most are sealed. Holmes nodded absently, but evidently not all. This one was recently opened. There are scratch marks on the interior surface here. See, someone passed through this very route. And very recently. He turned to Cecily. Do you keep a record of who has access to these panels? She shook her head. No one has touched them in years, Mr. Holmes. We believed them bricked over. Yet someone not only knew of their existence, he said, but also their purpose. It was an ideal route for a killer. Silent, invisible. That dagger was hidden in panic, but the real question remains, who moved within these walls? I asked, could it have been the groundskeeper? The one-eyed man? Possibly, Holmes said. But there is a curious contradiction. If he vanished the day after the murder, why would the dagger remain here? Why not take the weapon with him, unless, of course, he never left at all? Miss Harrogate looked faint. You believe he might still be in the house? Holmes's eyes narrowed. I believe he may never have left these walls alive. We descended back into the drawing room. where Holmes lit his pipe and paced beneath the oil portrait of Alaric Harrogate. I poured Miss Harrogate a glass of sherry as she attempted to steady her nerves. Holmes suddenly stopped and addressed her. "Tell me, Miss Harrogate, was your brother in sound mind before his death?" She hesitated. "I believe so. He was a private man, but no more than usual. However, in the final fortnight, he became reclusive. He would lock himself in the library for hours, murmuring about the legacy and the price of old sins. I thought it was grief. Our family has seen too many funerals." "Did he consult with any guests? Clergymen? Solicitors?" "No, none but Mr. Fenwick, the family steward. He has served us for over 30 years. "And where is Mr. Fenwick now?" "In the north wing. I can summon him if you wish." Holmes nodded. "Please do." Mr. Alfred Fenwick arrived shortly after, a lean, angular man in his 60s, with deep-set eyes and an expression like dry parchment. He bowed stiffly. "Mr. Holmes, I understand you are here at Miss Harrogate's behest. I regret that I can offer little aid. I found Master Alaric's body myself, broken on the rocks below the cliff path." "Where was the pendant?" "Gone," Fenwick said, "but we presumed it lost during the fall." Holmes steepled his fingers. "Tell me, Mr. Fenwick, do you believe it was an accident?" The steward hesitated. "I am uncertain. I saw no other footprints near the edge of the cliff, only his. But the path is slick after rain. The wind that night was fierce." "Yet you speak as if you doubt your own eyes." "There were other things, sounds, voices in the night, but surely those were nothing more than the echoes of old stone." Holmes leaned forward. "And what of the amber pendant?" "An ill token," Fenwick said. "It is carved from fossilized resin said to hold an insect inside, an ancient bee. But the legend is older still. It was brought to Harrogate in 1612 during the witch trials. Some say it bears a curse, that every heir who wears it dies violently." Holmes seemed to ponder this. "Superstition can be a useful tool for deception." I asked, "Was there anyone who might gain from Alaric's death?" Fenwick replied without blinking, "Only young Edward. He is now the sole heir. But the boy is innocent. He sleeps with a candle lit and weeps for his father. No, if there is foul play, the motive lies elsewhere." Holmes rose. "Thank you, Mr. Fenwick. That will be all, for now." That night, Holmes and I were assigned adjoining rooms in the east corridor. Rain lashed the windows, and the wind howled across the moorlands like a grieving spirit. I lay awake for hours listening. At precisely 2 o'clock I heard it, a soft, scraping sound, not from the hallway, but from within the walls. I rose quietly and knocked on the shared wall between our rooms. Holmes responded instantly, his silhouette appearing in the doorway. "You heard it as well?" he asked. I nodded. It came from behind the panelling. Without a word, Holmes crossed the floor and produced a small folding blade from his dressing gown. With practiced care, he pried open a narrow board near the fireplace. Behind it, darkness. Holmes reached in and struck a match. The space was perhaps 3 feet wide, dust-filled, with old beams and cobwebs. The sound had stopped. "There are footprints," he whispered. "Fresh. The dust has been disturbed." He pulled a lantern from his travel case and lit it. We follow. The passage snaked through the inner structure of the manor, narrow, suffocating. Our shoulders brushed centuries-old brickwork. At one point we passed a vertical shaft where the scent of damp salt hung heavy. And then we heard it. A low whisper, words unintelligible yet distinct. Holmes motioned for silence, and we crept forward. The passage ended at a small iron grate. Beyond it lay a chamber I did not recognize, lit by flickering candlelight. We crouched silently, peering through the bars. A figure stood in the room, cloaked in black, with a cowl drawn low. In his hand he held something glinting. Holmes inhaled softly. The pendant. The man was speaking to someone we could not see. Blood was not enough. The heir must be taken. The Harrogate name must die with him. Holmes turned to me, lips pressed thin. There are two of them. Suddenly the cloaked figure turned toward the grate. Holmes doused the lantern, but not fast enough. A shout rang out, "Who's there?" Footsteps thundered as the man bolted from the chamber. We turned and ran back through the passage, the air now filled with the sound of pursuit. We emerged into the drawing room, gasping. Holmes slammed the panel shut. He saw us. I reached for the bell. "Shall I wake the household?" "No," Holmes said. "Not yet. That chamber must be found by daylight. And the figure—" He paused, frowning. "Watson, did you notice the hand?" "The hand?" He was missing 2 fingers. Holmes stared into the fire, a one-eyed man with a maimed hand, and a stolen heirloom. "This is no ghost, my friend. This is a killer cloaked in legend, and he walks these halls still." The morning after our nocturnal discovery dawned grey and bitterly cold. A mist had settled thick upon the cliffs, obscuring the moors beyond like a funeral shroud. Holmes was already dressed and pacing the library when I entered, rubbing sleep from my eyes. On the table before him lay a map of the estate, a sheet of yellowed parchment bearing markings in ink that appeared to have faded long ago. "I took the liberty," he said without turning, "of removing this from a bound volume of the manor's architectural history. Fascinating how the modern drawings omit certain features that existed in older plans." I bent over the map. "This tunnel we found last night. Here?" Holmes pointed. "Indeed, but more to the point, this hidden chamber, the one we glimpsed beyond the iron grate, is not listed at all in contemporary records. And yet here, in this 1728 blueprint, it is clearly marked as the Saltwell Chapel, a subterranean room used for rites during the manor's earliest days, when superstition walked hand in hand with aristocracy." He tapped the lower corner of the plan. "It lies beneath the oldest part of the house, the chapel wing. Most of it is sealed now, but I believe there may still be a means of reaching it from within the cellar vaults." As he spoke, Miss Harrogate entered. Her eyes were tired, her manner subdued. "Did you learn anything last night?" she asked. Holmes folded the map carefully. "Yes, there is a hidden chamber beneath your estate, and someone still uses it. Someone with a maimed hand and a singular interest in your nephew's inheritance." She sat slowly. "Then you believe I was right, that Alaric was murdered?" Holmes said, "Not only murdered, Miss Harrogate. Lured. The pendant may not have been the motive. It may have been the bait." She paled. "But who would do such a thing, and why?" "I intend to find out," Holmes said, "but I must ask something difficult. I require permission to inspect your brother's study in its entirety, and I would speak with Edward again." Her voice trembled. "I trust you, Mr. Holmes. Take whatever measures you need." We began in Alaric Harrogate's private study. It was a vaulted chamber on the 3rd floor, with tall windows that faced the sea. The desk had been cleared of most personal effects, but Holmes was never one to accept appearances at face value. "Observe the desk drawers," he said, "all perfectly aligned. Yet this one," he pointed, has more resistance than the others, a false back perhaps. He withdrew a penknife and carefully pried at the seam inside the lowest drawer. With a faint pop, the back wall gave way, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside, a leather-bound journal, a bundle of sealed letters and a scrap of gold ribbon. Holmes unfolded the ribbon and sniffed it. Salt and something else. Musk and decay. I opened the journal. The entries were erratic, sometimes no more than a line or two, others feverishly detailed. Most troubling were the final pages written in a different hand, shaky and uneven. I saw him in the mirror again. The amber eye watches even in dreams. I cannot escape the chapel's call. Last night the whispers came from beneath the hearth. He said, "Blood must return to blood." I looked up. This man was losing his mind. Or being driven from it, Holmes said grimly, by someone who knew precisely how to manipulate him. He examined the letters, all addressed to a Father Mallory, clergyman of St. Austell Parish. Odd. Why would a man of Alaric's secular disposition write repeatedly to a priest? I recall the name, I said. The family chapel was deconsecrated a century ago, but the Mallorys served as chaplains for generations. Holmes was quiet a moment. "Watson, we shall visit this Father Mallory, but first, the cellars." The cellar vaults were cold and dark, with stone arches that stretched endlessly into gloom. We brought lanterns and descended with care. Holmes examined the ground, pausing now and again to inspect scuff marks in the dust. "Boot prints," he muttered. "Large, broad-soled, 2 sets, one fresh, the other older. Someone's been down here since the murder." I asked, "Could it be the same figure we saw last night?" Holmes gave a rare, grim smile. "I believe it must be. Let's see where he leads." We followed the trail deeper until it reached a sealed archway. The stonework here was newer than the surrounding walls, and a faint draught hissed through the mortar. Holmes knelt, placing a palm against the brick. Still damp. This wall was altered recently, weeks ago at most. He stood and gave the wall a sharp tap with the butt of his walking stick. A hollow echo answered. With effort we pried at the edges. Bricks loosened, mortar cracked, the wall fell away. Behind it was a stairwell, spiralling downward into blackness. Holmes lit a second lantern and motioned for me to follow. "This, Watson, is the path to the Saltwell Chapel." The air grew colder with each step. The stone staircase twisted tightly until we reached an iron-banded door, rusted and swollen with age. Holmes tested the latch. It opened with a groan of protest, revealing a subterranean chamber lit faintly by cracks in the ceiling far above. The chapel was octagonal, with walls marked by strange symbols, a mix of alchemical sigils and what I suspected were old druidic carvings. At the far end stood a raised dais, upon which rested a cracked stone altar. In the centre of that altar, nestled in a velvet-lined groove, lay a small, gleaming object. The pendant, the amber eye. Holmes stepped forward, slowly examining the space. No dust. Someone has been using this room recently. I picked up the pendant. "It's warm," I said. "Almost unnaturally so." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "There's something else." He turned and pointed to the floor behind the altar. Barely visible, smeared into the flagstone, was a symbol written in dried blood. An eye encircled in flame. Holmes was about to speak when a metallic sound rang through the chapel. We spun around. Standing in the doorway, lantern held high, was Mr. Fenwick, or rather, what remained of him. The right side of his face was scarred. His right hand, missing 2 fingers, gripped a pistol. Holmes spoke calmly. "So it was you." Fenwick's voice was unrecognizable, low and gravelled. "The blood must be answered. The Harrogate line must pay its price. It was promised to me." I stepped forward. "You killed Alaric?" "No," he said. "I only showed him the truth. The pendant did the rest." He raised the pistol, but Holmes was already moving. A shout, a struggle. The pistol discharged into the ceiling. I tackled Fenwick as Holmes twisted the weapon from his grasp. Together we forced him to the ground. Holmes held the pendant before Fenwick's face. "You gave him this. You whispered madness through the walls. You led him here and let his own fears consume him." Fenwick snarled. "The eye watches all. The line ends now. The child must follow." Holmes stood. "Not if I can help it." Fenwick was bound and confined in one of the manor's abandoned storage rooms, guarded by 2 footmen who, though bewildered, obeyed Holmes without question. Miss Harrogate, upon hearing of the confrontation in the chapel, had gone pale and collapsed into a chair, trembling violently. "I trusted him," she whispered. "He was with us since I was a child. He watched over Edward like a grandfather." Holmes, whose sympathy was rarely given freely, offered her a brief but sincere nod. "His betrayal is regrettable, but it has saved Edward's life." "But why, Mr. Holmes?" she cried. "Why now? What could drive him to madness?" Holmes's response was immediate. "Not madness, Miss Harrogate, purpose. It is my belief that Fenwick, possibly under another identity, was a remnant of an older order, a cult or society dedicated to an ancient oath, one that demanded the extinction of your bloodline." She stared. "But why would anyone wish for the destruction of the Harrogate family?" "That," Holmes said, "is what we must now uncover." Later that day, Holmes and I took the train north to St. Austell Parish to find Father Mallory, the clergyman to whom Alaric had written several urgent letters before his death. The rectory stood near the churchyard, a squat stone cottage half covered in ivy. An old man answered the door, stooped, narrow-eyed, but sharp of voice. "Yes?" he asked. "Father Mallory?" Holmes inquired. The priest nodded slowly. "And who might you be?" "Sherlock Holmes. This is my associate, Dr. Watson. We're investigating the death of Alaric Harrogate. He wrote to you, did he not?" Mallory's brow furrowed. "Come in." The rectory smelled of books and old wood smoke. Father Mallory led us into a study filled with religious texts, maps of Cornwall, and a single-framed portrait of a woman, young, severe, and dressed in Tudor garb. "My ancestor," Mallory said, gesturing to the painting. "She was the first Mallory to serve the Harrogates as chaplain, though not officially. She was branded a heretic in 1613. Holmes raised an eyebrow. "Interesting. And your family has continued in this role for 4 centuries? "In various forms, yes. Though the chapel fell out of use, our lineage remained tied to theirs. There is history between our families." "Please," Holmes said, "speak freely." Mallory sighed and pulled a battered leather journal from his bookshelf. "This belonged to my grandfather. He documented what he called the binding of the eye. It was an oath sworn by a sect that predated the Anglican Church, founded among salt miners who believed the amber pendant held divine wrath." He turned the book to face us. A rough sketch of the pendant stared up at us, perfectly rendered, down to the insect trapped inside. "It was believed," Mallory continued, "that the pendant housed a watcher, a spirit which demanded sacrifice. The Harrogates once led this cult until they renounced it in 1711, but in doing so, they made enemies. Some descendants of the sect vowed to see the Harrogate line extinguished, accusing them of betrayal. Holmes's eyes gleamed. And Fenwick? Mallory nodded grimly. I believe he was one of them. He vanished from parish records in 1868, reappeared 20 years later as a steward. It is likely he was planted at the manor to await his chance. Then Alaric's death, I murmured, was not just a murder, it was a ritual. Yes, Mallory said, and if you hadn't stopped him, Edward would have been next. We returned to Harrogate Manor that evening and found Miss Harrogate sitting beside her nephew by the fire. Edward had not been told of Fenwick's betrayal, only that he had left suddenly. Holmes requested a private audience with the boy. Edward led us to the library, his footsteps light but his eyes alert. Edward, Holmes said gently, you once said the man in the walls had only one eye. Can you remember anything else about him? The boy frowned. He talked to me, but not with his mouth like whispers, but inside my head. Holmes nodded. And what did he say? That I was chosen, that the eye saw everything, and that my father wore the pendant too long. Holmes knelt to the boy's level. Did you ever see the pendant? Edward hesitated. Once, in Father's drawer. He said it was dangerous, but he kept touching it. Holmes looked at me gravely. Then the pendant did more than attract death. It infected the mind. He rose. Miss Harrogate must never let the boy see it again. As for the pendant itself, we must find a way to destroy it safely. That night, I awoke again to the sound of creaking boards, but this time not from within the walls. A voice echoed down the hallway. Cecily's. I hurried into the corridor, lantern in hand. Holmes was already ahead of me, rounding the corner toward the west wing. There by the open door of Alaric's bedroom stood Miss Harrogate, her face pale and her finger pointing toward the interior. "He's back," she whispered. "There's someone in the room." Holmes entered cautiously, signalling me to stay behind her. The bed was untouched, the room still except for the armoire. Its doors stood slightly ajar. Holmes flung them open. Nothing, until we looked down. A square cut in the floorboards revealed a narrow shaft, a vertical tunnel descending deep beneath the house. He wasn't just in the walls, Holmes murmured. He lived beneath them. At dawn, we assembled a team of groundsmen and descended the shaft, which led to a narrow corridor carved from the stone itself. The air was damp, fetid with the scent of sea rot and decay. At the far end we found a low, domed chamber. The ceiling was blackened with soot. Ritual symbols had been painted in blood along the stone. In the centre was a table made of bones, real human bones. Upon it sat a second pendant. Holmes paled. "A duplicate?" "No," I said, examining it. "Older, cracked, but the same design." Holmes removed it with a cloth. This was the original. Fenwick must have used it as a lure to bring Alaric to the Salt Chapel. He gave the newer pendant to the victim, but his true loyalty was to this, the artifact of his cult. "And what now?" I asked. Holmes looked around the chamber. This room must be sealed, this pendant must be destroyed, and the truth buried with it. As the morning broke, Holmes gave strict instructions to the local authorities. Fenwick was taken into custody, incoherent and raving about the eye in the blood and the salt-born god. Miss Harrogate, under Holmes's advice, planned to take Edward far from Devon for a time, possibly abroad. We stood by the cliffs as the workers prepared to collapse the secret tunnel behind the manor. Holmes, staring out at the sea, spoke softly. "The mind, Watson, is a delicate mechanism. It can be sharpened like a blade, or turned like a weather vane by the wind of suggestion. Alaric was not weak, but he was alone. That was all Fenwick needed." "And the pendant?" He opened the leather pouch in which it lay and drew out a small hammer. "This time," he said, "we leave no questions." With a single strike, the amber cracked, then shattered. Inside was a tiny mummified insect, some ancient creature preserved through eons. Holmes dropped the fragments into the sea. "It's over," he said, but something in his voice made me wonder whether he truly believed it. Despite the destruction of the pendant and Fenwick's arrest, a chill still hung over Harrogate Manor, one not born of wind or rain, but of uncertainty. Holmes's manner changed noticeably in the days that followed. He spoke less and smoked more. He would often sit for hours, eyes unfocused, as though listening to some echo that only he could hear. We remained at the manor per Miss Harrogate's request, primarily to assist in securing Edward's future and overseeing the investigation of the chapel's hidden passages. I had hoped our role had drawn to a close, but Holmes's instincts said otherwise. "It's too tidy," he muttered one evening, flipping through Alaric's journal for the third time. "Fenwick was a zealot, yes, but not a liar, not insane. That chamber beneath the house, built centuries ago, untouched save for him. How could a single man operate for so long without discovery?" "Are you suggesting another party was involved?" "I'm saying Fenwick may not have been the architect of this madness," Holmes replied. "Merely its steward." I frowned. "But the pendant, wasn't it the source of all this?" "Perhaps. Or perhaps it was a symbol, the vehicle, not the engine." 2 days later, we received word that Fenwick had died. The constable's message was brief and grim. Found unresponsive in his cell. No sign of struggle. Witnesses claim he spoke aloud during the night in an unknown tongue before seizing violently. Physician suspects heart failure. Before expiring, he reportedly uttered one phrase: "She is not done." Holmes folded the paper slowly. "The question is, who is she?" Miss Harrogate was visibly shaken by the news. "Do you mean to say this spirit, or whatever it is, may still be among us?" Holmes offered us neutral expression. "I cannot say with certainty, but I would advise caution. I would also like to examine your family's private records. I believe the truth may yet lie, not with Fenwick, but with the past." The Harrogate archives occupied a narrow tower attached to the west wing. Generations of birth records, legal documents, land deeds, and handwritten correspondences were stored in boxes, many of them untouched for decades. Holmes plunged into the stacks with zeal, extracting boxes at random, flipping through brittle papers, comparing handwriting samples and symbols. "Watson," he said, "look at this." He handed me a folded letter. The paper was stiff, the ink brown with age. "To my son, Edric. If you are reading this, then I have failed to end the curse. The watchers in the salt wells are older than we, older than Scripture. The pendant is a key, but it is not the only one. Her name is Aveline. She was once of our blood, but she betrayed it, bound herself to the old things beneath the cliffs. She waits in silence, and she watches through the amber." RH 1791. I looked up. "Aveline?" Holmes nodded. "It appears the name she refers not to a spirit, but a person, or something that once was." And you believe this Aveline still exists? Not physically, but as a legend, a doctrine. Perhaps. The name recurs across multiple documents, always tied to the chapel, the pendant, and the family curse. We searched the archives for hours. Finally, Holmes pulled free a water-damaged ledger, its spine cracking in his hands. Here, Evelyn Harrogate, died 1615, accused of witchcraft and treason, body buried. Listen to this. Not in the family plot, but in the salt crypt beneath the well, sealed by ecclesiastical order. Aveline, I murmured. She was real. Holmes's voice was tight, and perhaps she was also Fenwick's goddess. The next morning, Holmes requested the groundsman accompany us to the lower cliffs near the salt wells. These natural formations, vast mineral-rich caves where the tide carved out great hollows, were partially collapsed in the 1800s, but still partially navigable by foot. With lanterns in hand, we descended the slick path into the wells. The scent of brine and rot was thick. Our guide, an elderly fisherman named Corwin, kept close. "This cave's been cursed longer than I've been alive," he said. "No birds nest here. No fish swim beneath. The old folk say the rocks whisper when the tide comes in." Holmes said nothing, but his eyes were sharp and watchful. We reached a sunken hollow where seawater pooled in a wide, natural basin, and there, hidden among stalagmites, stood a sealed stone door, crusted in salt and nearly invisible in the gloom. Holmes approached. "This is it." "How can you tell?" He pointed to the carvings, the eye in flame, the same sigil from the chapel, and beneath it, a name. Carved in uneven but unmistakable script, a VELINE. With the help of the groundsman we pried the stone loose. Behind it lay a narrow corridor, and at its end a stone chamber carved directly into the cliff wall. It was a tomb. The room was octagonal, mirroring the shape of the salt chapel. In the centre stood a sarcophagus, weathered and cracked. At its head, another pendant, this one far older, twisted with age and blackened with decay. Holmes approached cautiously. The original. The air felt heavier here, as though weighed down by centuries of silence. He reached into his coat and produced the fragments of the destroyed pendant. "Let's see if the pieces remember." He placed the shards upon the stone lid. At once a sharp sound pierced the air, metal scraping on stone. The lid trembled. We stepped back. From within, a low voice echoed. A woman's, neither warm nor cruel, but inevitably present. "You have broken the bond." Edward's scream echoed down the corridor. We raced back to the manor, hearts pounding. Miss Harrogate met us halfway in the corridor, pale and shaking. "He's gone," she said. "Edward's gone. I left him for only minutes. The window's open. There are footprints leading toward the cliffs." Holmes didn't hesitate. "Get every lantern, every man. We search the cliffs now." The storm broke as we reached the edge of the rocks. Wind howled. Rain slashed sideways. The sea below boiled with rage. And there, at the cliff's edge, stood Edward, unmoving, eyes wide, staring at the sea, and just behind him, a woman. She was not real, or not only real. Pale dress, black hair, eyes like burning amber. She raised her hand toward Edward, but Holmes was faster. He stepped between them. "There is no power left for you," he said. "Your bond is broken. You are only memory now. Memory dies." The wind shrieked. The apparition flared, twisted, then vanished like smoke in the gale. Edward collapsed. Holmes caught him. The next morning dawned still and cold. the cliffs wrapped in a quiet mist that clung to every stone like a shroud. The storm had passed, but the residue of what we had seen, what we had experienced, clung to our bones like seawater in a deep wound. Holmes stood alone on the terrace outside Harrogate Manor, staring over the sea where the spectre of Aveline had appeared. I joined him, placing a hand on his shoulder. Was she real, Holmes? He didn't answer immediately. She was remembered, perhaps too well. Sometimes memory, when fed by fear, grows teeth. He took a long breath, then turned to me. We are nearly at the heart of it, Watson, but I fear the final revelation may shake the foundation of this household more than any ghost. Back inside, Edward was recovering. He had no memory of walking to the cliffs, nor of the woman with the amber eyes. He only recalled dreaming of his father's voice, calling him from the salt wells. Miss Harrogate was still pale, and though she tried to comfort Edward, I could see she too was haunted by last night's vision. Holmes called for a family meeting in the library, insisting that both she and the boy be present. "There is something you must both hear," he said, pacing before the hearth, "and you, Miss Harrogate, must decide what happens next." He drew forth the documents we had retrieved from the Harrogate archives, chief among them the letter from R.H., dated 1791. It is clear now that Aveline Harrogate was no myth. She existed, and she died under circumstances so strange that even the church sought to hide her final resting place. Her burial site, sealed in the salt wells, became the seed of a cult that passed through generations in secret, waiting for a chance to reclaim their so-called Eye of the Watcher. He turned toward Cecily. Fenwick was one of them, perhaps not by birth, but certainly by initiation, and I believe he was placed in this house with the singular mission to destroy the Harrogate line. But someone, stopped him before he could finish. "Who?" I asked. Holmes looked at Edward, then at Cecily. Miss Harrogate stiffened. "What are you implying?" "I am suggesting that Alaric was not the final heir." The room fell into silence. Holmes continued. "Your records, Miss Harrogate, list Edward as Alaric's son, but there is a 10-year gap between Alaric's marriage and Edward's birth, and no mention of a mother. That's because Alaric never married. Edward is not his child." Miss Harrogate's voice trembled. "That's not possible." Holmes's gaze softened. "Not in the way you think. Edward is your son, isn't he?" She covered her mouth. Tears welled in her eyes. "Yes, but I never meant to lie. It was to protect him. I feared the estate, the curse. It all demanded a male heir. Alaric agreed to the arrangement. He raised Edward as his own." Holmes nodded. "Then Edward is not the bloodline the cult feared." Cecily looked up sharply. "Then, why try to take him?" "Because they didn't know." Fenwick believed what he had been told. He saw Edward as the heir. That made him the target. I stared at Holmes. "Then the line of Harrogate ends with Cecily." "No," Holmes said, turning back toward the hearth. "That's the final layer of this puzzle. The curse never wanted the bloodline destroyed. It wanted it preserved." We all stared. Holmes removed a final letter from his pocket, one we had discovered in the tomb below the salt well, a letter written by Aveline herself. "I do not curse my kin. I preserve them. The eye sees what the living cannot. When the last bearer understands its light, the watchers will sleep. Until then, blood must remember." Holmes said softly, "Aveline did not damn her descendants. She tried to warn them. The curse was a myth woven by others. those who twisted her memory into madness. She wanted the Harrogate line to survive, to keep the watchers sealed. Miss Harrogate sat in silence, the realization dawning slowly in her eyes. Then the pendant was never a curse, Holmes finished. It was a beacon, a signal to those who carried the bloodline to remain vigilant. She took Edward's hand. Then it's over. We can live. We can leave this place. Holmes paused, then nodded. Yes, but before you do, one more thing must be done. We returned once more to the tomb of Aveline. Holmes carried the blackened pendant from her sarcophagus, as well as the shattered pieces of the second pendant. At the centre of the stone altar he placed both sets of fragments. He then produced from his coat a small iron box, sealed tightly. "What is that?" I asked. "Salt," Holmes said. "Purified. Alaric's notes hinted at it repeatedly. It was the key." He poured the salt over the pendants, then set them alight. The fire flared blue. The flames danced along the carvings of the altar. And then, with a sound like a sigh, they died. The chamber fell into darkness. Holmes stood still, then he said quietly, "Now it's over." We left Harrogate the next morning. Cecily and Edward would soon depart for the continent, their future unshackled from ghosts of the past. Holmes and I boarded the train to London, and for the first time in weeks he leaned back in his seat without lighting his pipe. I turned to him. "Do you think there are others like Fenwick? Others who still believe?" He considered the question. Perhaps. But they are remnants now, scattered fragments of a story that no longer holds power. The truth has outlived the lie. "And what of the Watchers?" Holmes's expression was unreadable. "That, Watson, is not for us to know, only to remember. And memory, as we've seen, is sometimes the most dangerous force of all." 3 weeks passed in London. The pace of city life returned swiftly, but I noticed a shift in Holmes, something I had seen only rarely after past cases of the darkest kind. He had resumed his practice, of course, solving a forgery in Mayfair and preventing a duel in Kensington, yet his mind often drifted. He would pause mid-conversation, staring into the middle distance, his fingers twitching near his temple as though chasing some lingering echo. One evening, I found him standing in our sitting room at Baker Street, staring at the single surviving scrap of the pendant he had brought back from Harrogate. It sat in a glass vial upon the mantel, its once polished surface now black and brittle. "You kept a piece?" I asked, uneasy. "I needed to know," Holmes said, "whether the power we witnessed resided in the artifact or in the belief surrounding it." He turned to me. "Tell me, Watson, have you dreamt of it?" I hesitated. "Yes, once. I was in the chapel. The salt wind was howling. There was singing, a woman's voice, but when I turned to see her, the room was empty." Holmes nodded solemnly. "Then we are not free of it yet." The following morning, a letter arrived by express post. It bore no return address. Inside was a folded piece of paper, coarse, thick, torn at the edges. Upon it was a simple phrase, "The Watchers stir in Vienna." Holmes turned it over, sniffed the seal and frowned. "Handmade parchment, Austrian, ink mixed with myrrh oil. Someone wants to be noticed." "Do you believe it?" I asked. "I believe," Holmes said, "that if there are echoes of Aveline's cult, Vienna would be a likely place. The Harrogates had trade ties there in the 1700s. Some members of the sect may have fled east when their efforts failed here." He stared out the window. "Watson, would you object to a short holiday?" We arrived in Vienna 2 days later, staying at a modest hotel not far from the Stephansdom Cathedral. Holmes, of course, had already traced the paper's origin to a particular printing press near the Jewish quarter. Its owner, a mute artisan named Thaddeus, had no records of his customers but confirmed via a note that the batch had been commissioned 3 months earlier by a woman with black hair and an English accent. She used the name Hargrave, he scribbled. Not Harrogate, Holmes muttered, but close enough to draw my attention. She wanted me to come. Do you believe she's a cultist? I asked. Or something worse, Holmes said, a true believer. We found her 3 days later, not through cunning, but through invitation. A card arrived under our door at midnight. It bore the crest of a forgotten noble house and only one line of text. There are watchers in all cities of salt. It was signed A.H. Her name was Aveline Harrogate, I said. Holmes nodded grimly. But this cannot be her. This is someone claiming her legacy. The address led us to a hidden chapel beneath a crumbling bathhouse along the Danube. The steps were narrow, wet with condensation. At the base, lit by a ring of lanterns, stood a woman. She was perhaps 40, hair black as ink, eyes luminous amber. She smiled. Mr. Holmes, you're late. Holmes did not flinch. I don't believe we've met. No, she said, but I know you. You broke the pendant. You walked in the tomb. You faced her memory. And you are? A child of the salt, she said, as if that explained anything. We are few now. The watchers no longer listen as they once did, but they stir still, quietly, through minds like yours, through cracks in stone, through blood. I stepped forward. The cult was broken, its leader is dead, the pendant is destroyed. She turned to me amused. You still think this is about objects? It was never about the amber. That was a lens, nothing more. She raised her hand. In her palm was another pendant, but this one was hollow, carved not from amber, but bone. Holmes narrowed his eyes. What do you want? She looked at him then, something almost tender in her gaze. You are the last man of sense they'll ever listen to. Come with me. See the vault. Understand. Or let it spread. Holmes did not answer, but I saw the decision forming behind his eyes. We followed her into a narrow corridor behind the chapel. It opened into a large circular vault, a domed space lined with carvings that matched those from the Saltwell Chapel in Harrogate. At its centre, a stone table bore dozens of relics, scrolls, rings, vials of preserved insects, and bones wrapped in salt-crusted cloth. This, the woman said, is a memory bank. Not of people, of fears. Every watcher is born from human terror. Every relic here is soaked in the psychic debris of centuries. Holmes paced the room slowly. And you believe preserving this will protect mankind? I believe understanding it, she said, is our only hope, or they return. Holmes paused before a casket of dark stone. And if I destroy it? Then we will scatter, she said calmly. And reform. The watchers live in patterns, not things. Holmes looked at her for a long time, then said, Let them come. I've seen worse. He lit a match. The fire in the vault burned hot and fast. I remember pulling artifacts from the shelves to feed the flames, Holmes smashing vials with his cane. The woman never resisted. She only watched, tears running down her face, silent and still. When it was over, Holmes turned to her. No more watchers, no more salt, no more names. She said, Then you've killed memory itself. Holmes shook his head. Number I've rewritten it. We left Vienna the next morning. No press reported the fire, no police arrived. It was as if the entire chapel had slipped back into shadow. Back in London, Holmes placed the final shard of the original pendant into a lead box and dropped it into the Thames. Then he turned to me and said, "It is finished now, truly." 3 months had passed since Vienna. Autumn arrived in London draped in fog, bringing with it the familiar sense of coal smoke, damp leaves and rain-soaked stone. Life on Baker Street resumed in fits and starts. Letters from former clients, a few minor scandals involving the nobility, even an attempted theft of the Crown's tax archives. But Holmes was restless. He was a man who lived upon thresholds, the edge between the rational and the unseen, and since our journey into the tomb of the Watchers, his equilibrium had been disturbed. I had hoped that the final destruction of the artifacts in Vienna might restore his old spark, but instead it was as though he had left some vital part of himself in the fire. One morning I found him seated by the window, unmoving, a telegram clutched in one hand. Without a word he passed it to me. From Cecily Harrogate, location, Athens, Greece. Message, Edward ill, symptoms began 3 days ago. Fever, speaks of eyes in wall, doctor befuddled. Come, please. I looked up slowly. Holmes's eyes were glassy. She told me he was safe, he murmured. We both did. We sailed the next day. Upon arriving in Athens, we were met not by Cecily, but by a man in clerical garb, Father Demetriou, a scholar of Byzantine mysticism and a friend of the Harrogate family. He explained with great tact that Cecily had brought Edward to him 2 nights earlier, after the boy began speaking in tongues and clawing at his bedroom walls. "I've seen cases like this," the priest said, "but never so young. It is as if something entered him, something old." Holmes did not respond. He strode past the man and into the stone courtyard where Cecily sat on a bench beside a shuttered guest house. She rose at once, her face gaunt and sleepless. "I don't know how," she said. "I burned everything. I swore it was over." Holmes took her hand. "It isn't your fault." We entered the guest house together. Edward lay in a makeshift bed near the fireplace. His skin was pale, his lips cracked, but what struck me most was his eyes. They were open, but not focused. They stared through the ceiling, unblinking, as if seeing something beyond the room, beyond the sky. He whispered one word, again and again. "Beneath." That night, Holmes pored over maps of Athens, specifically those of its older strata, the layers beneath the city that dated back to antiquity. He circled an area on the edge of the Plaka district, an abandoned Ottoman cistern that had once served as a secret church during the 16th century. "I trace the Harrogate name," he said, "not through England, but Byzantium. A family line exiled in 1453. They called themselves the Hargates. And guess where they fled?" I blinked. "Athens," Holmes nodded. "This didn't begin in Devon, it didn't begin with Aveline. She was merely the first one who remembered." He stood. "Come, Watson. We must go beneath." Once more. We descended into the cistern at dawn, lanterns in hand. The air was thick with mildew and silence. Moss clung to the ancient walls. The steps were slick with centuries of condensation. Beneath the cistern lay a vaulted room, a forgotten chapel built of rough stone and crowned with a faded fresco of a single golden eye. The eye in flame. But there was something else. In the centre of the room stood a simple stone cradle, and inside it, wrapped in faded robes, was a third pendant, Holmes approached slowly. He did not touch it. "It's waiting," he said, "but it's not calling to me." I approached as well. The object pulsed faintly, not with light, but with a sensation, like the memory of warmth. Holmes turned to me. "This isn't a weapon." "What is it, then?" He knelt beside it. "A memory vault, like in Vienna, but deeper, older. This was the original sanctuary, the first Harrogate shrine." And then Holmes did something that surprised me. He placed his hand upon the cradle and whispered, "I remember." The room shifted. The fresco above us gleamed briefly with fresh gold. I heard distant voices chanting, laughing, weeping, a woman's lullaby, a child's first cry, and beneath it all silence, but not empty silence, a peaceful, protective quiet. Then the sounds faded, the light dimmed, and the pendant at last went still. Holmes stood, breathing heavily. That's what it was always meant to do, not torment, but preserve the memories of a family too broken to speak its own name. He turned to me, the shadow gone from his face. It was twisted by zealots, perverted by fear, but it was never evil. When we returned to the surface, Edward was already sitting up. His fever had broken. He did not speak of eyes, only of a dream, his mother's voice calling him home. Cecily wept. Holmes stood quietly by the door, and I, perhaps for the first time, felt the weight of what we had undone. Not a curse, not a ghost, but a legacy, forgotten and buried, now finally at peace. That evening, we watched the sun dip below the Aegean. The sea was calm. Holmes had said little since our return, but I knew he was at peace. "Do you think it's truly over?" I asked. Holmes smiled faintly. "Yes, Watson. Not because we ended it, but because we understood it." We returned to London lighter in spirit. Holmes no longer haunted the window in our flat, nor did he vanish for hours into his archives. For a time he was a man relieved of burden, no longer tracking shadows through salt and blood. But memory, as always, is a thread, one that, when tugged, may reveal knots that were never truly untied. It was a letter from Mycroft Holmes that reignited the flame. Delivered by private courier, sealed with the wax insignia of the British government, it was brief and pointed. To Sherlock, we've uncovered references to a dormant file labelled Project H. Contents suggest a suppressed inquiry into cognitive anomalies among certain British noble lineages, including but not limited to the Harrogate bloodline. The project was terminated without conclusion in 1883. You may wish to review it. M.H. Holmes read it once, then again. Then he looked at me with an expression I'd seen only twice before, once during the Irene Adler affair, and once when we found the letter sewn into the corpse of a murdered cardinal in Rome. "They knew," he said quietly. "Someone in the government knew." We travelled that same evening to a secured archive beneath Westminster. Mycroft had arranged clearance. The vault was located beneath the Treasury, a dim corridor of steel cabinets and locked iron drawers, attended by a single clerk who, upon seeing Holmes, handed over a thick grey folder without a word. The file was brittle with age, stamped multiple times with the words, "Classified Section 5. C. No reproduction." Inside were reports, sketches, maps and transcripts. The first document chilled me to the marrow. Subject: E. Harrogate, aged 9. Described voices in sleep. Marked changes in temperature around sleeping quarters. referred to mother in the salt, dreams consistent with prior subjects traced to Devon lineages. The file was dated 1807. Impossible, I said aloud. There was no Edward Harrogate born in that year. Holmes flipped through the next pages. Perhaps not in the family records, but the cult may have adopted or even created children with the name, to test the line, or to sustain it. We read on. There were at least 7 such children over a 60-year period. Each referenced recurring phrases: the eye sees in salt, the watcher sleeps until named, blood must be closed. Some of the children died, others vanished. All files terminated in 1883. Holmes stood in silence for a full minute, then said, "It didn't end in Devon. It was relocated." I whispered, "To where?" Holmes turned the final page. A map. London. And on it, a single building circled in red ink. Asphodel House, South Kensington. Asphodel House was not listed on any contemporary registry. It was a private institution, shuttered in the 1890s, its facade now crumbling behind overgrown hedges and rusted iron gates. The architecture bore no era cleanly. It was part Greek Revival, part Tudor, part something far older, as if assembled by hands that had never agreed on style or purpose. We entered through the broken garden gate under cover of night. No one had lived there in decades. The walls were cracked with ivy. The floorboards moaned like ghosts remembering footsteps. Holmes moved with quiet certainty, as though the house whispered guidance. We reached a locked cellar door. With a twist of wire, Holmes had it open. We descended and found them. The room beneath Asphodel House was small, perhaps 20 feet across, but the moment I stepped inside, my knees weakened. The air was dense, wet, thinking. On the walls were names, dozens, perhaps hundreds, all scrawled in a childish hand. Names we recognized, and names we did not. At the center of the room was a pedestal, and atop it, another pendant. But this one was wrong. It pulsed not with light nor memory, but with heat, with hunger. Holmes approached, and the pendant spoke, not aloud, not in words, but in sensation, a wave of heat, then dread, then sorrow, then fury, all in the space of a single breath. Holmes staggered. I caught him. "Leave it, Holmes." He shook his head. "This is the final one, Watson. This is the origin, not Harrogate, not Vienna, here, buried beneath this city." He reached into his coat and drew out the last of the salt, the purified grains we had preserved from the well in Devon, and he poured them into the flame at the base of the pedestal. The pendant screamed, the walls buckled, and then it shattered. We escaped the cellar moments before the support beam collapsed, sealing the stairwell with stone and dust. Outside, the air had changed. Lighter. The pressure lifted, and I knew we had not destroyed an artifact. We had ended a pattern, a loop of memory and violence that had perpetuated itself through name, blood, and fear. Back at Baker Street, Holmes finally slept. For a full day and night he did not stir, and when he rose, he did not speak of pendants or cults again. But he kept a single item on our mantelpiece from that day forward, a grain of salt fused into crystal. He never explained why, but I understood. It was not a trophy, it was a warning. That memory, when misused, becomes shadow, but when remembered rightly, becomes light. The last leaves of winter had fallen, and the fog over Baker Street clung like gauze to every lamp-post. Inside our sitting room the fireplace burned low, and Holmes, quiet, sharp-eyed and still, sat opposite me with his violin resting on his knee. He had not played a note in over an hour. He merely held it, fingers curled as if listening not for music but for silence. "So," I said gently, "it's finished." Holmes raised his eyes. "Is it?" I didn't answer. I wasn't sure I could. The world, for all its occult whispers and ancient sects, had resumed its humdrum rhythm. The newspapers spoke of stock frauds and suffragettes, of a new opera at Covent Garden and the Queen's latest tour. No mention of Aveline Harrogate, no headlines on shattered pendants or Saltbourne watches. That was how it had to be. And yet, the story had not vanished entirely. It lingered in the margins, in whispers among fringe theologians, in burned journals retrieved from Vienna's vaults, in the dreams of a boy named Edward. Miss Harrogate had written to us weekly from Marseille, where she and Edward now lived in anonymity. Her latest letter was hopeful. Edward had begun painting, strange luminous pictures of quiet oceans and golden eyes. No fevers, no voices, but one line at the bottom stood out in a different ink. He still wakes sometimes whispering her name. Aveline. Holmes had stared at that line for a long time. He folded it neatly and placed it in his violin case. A week later he received a visitor, an elderly man with a military bearing, hair like ash and eyes the colour of smoke. He introduced himself only as Mr. Blackwood. He handed Holmes a dossier marked with the Crown's seal. Inside were notes from Project H updated. New names, new bloodlines. Holmes read in silence, then handed it to me. The final page chilled me. Re. Harrogate. Status: dormant. Subject: E. Harrogate, age 11. Observation ceased upon relocation to Marseille. Subject stable. No further anomalies observed. Marked termination clause invoked. Addendum. Subject's artwork now archived. Reference: 1174. See I in the brine. Possible psychic resonance pending. I looked up. They're still watching him. Holmes nodded. And they always will. That night Holmes gave me a sealed envelope. Should anything ever happen to me, he said, this must go to Mycroft. I opened it only once, years later. Inside was a single sentence. If memory is the weapon, we must teach the world to remember rightly. But that is not how this tale ends. Not in silence, not in fear. It ends instead in Devon. 2 years later, we returned. The manor had long since been sold, its chapel reclaimed by moss and ruin. But the cliffs stood unchanged. The salt wind still roared, and beneath our feet the watchers, real or imagined, were finally still. Holmes stood on the ledge, looking out over the sea. He spoke softly. Memory, Watson, is a curious thing. It holds pain longer than joy. But when cleansed, when faced head-on, it can become illumination. He handed me a single object wrapped in cloth. When I unwrapped it, I found a pendant, but not one of amber. This one was carved of clear glass, containing not an insect, but a folded scrap of paper inside. On it, Edward had written, in uneven child's hand, "She sleeps now." Holmes smiled, then turned toward the path home. Thus ends the tale of the Harrogate heirloom, a story of blood and salt, of artifacts and echoes, of watchers, real and imagined, and of a detective who stared into the oldest darkness and refused to blink.